This week on the Communicators, a discussion on how globalization has impacted the technology industry, with author and longtime high-tech executive and entrepreneur Richard Elkus.
Richard Elkus is a longtime high-tech executive and entrepreneur. He's written a new book, and it's called Winner Take All: How Competitiveness Shapes the Fate of Nations. And he is here to talk about how he feels the U.S. and U.S. industrial policy should be. Mr. Elkus, thank you for being on the Communicators.
Appreciate it.
I also want to introduce Jacob Kirkegaard. He's with the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and he's here as our guest co-host today on the Communicators.
Great to be here.
Mr. Elkus, if you could start by giving us a primer on yourself and why you wrote this book and some of your corporate background.
I graduated from Stanford, went to Dartmouth, Tuck School of Business. While I was in school, a company called Ampex Corporation invented a product called the videotape recorder. This was done in 1956. One of the gentlemen who helped invent it was a fellow by the name of Ray Dolby, who, as you well know, developed Dolby Sound, and I had the pleasure many years later of sitting on the selection committee for the National Medal of Technology when he got the reward for Dolby Sound. I was fascinated with the product, videotape recording. I felt that it would change the world, and I wanted to go to work there. So I applied for a job, got a job, slowly but surely worked my way up, and ended up at one point head of the Industrial Products Division, Industrial Educational Products Division of Ampex, and that had a technology called helical scan video recording, which became the basis for the VCR. While I was in that position, the CEO, Bill Roberts, who interestingly enough came out of Bell and Howell, worked for a gentleman by the name of Peterson. And I had a chance to meet with Mr. Peterson many years later. After that, asked him some questions. But in any case, Bill Roberts came to me and said, we've all looked at different ways of coming up with a home video recorder, and we'd like to see if you could come up with some sort of thoughts on that matter. So in 1968, exactly 40 years ago, I presented him with a plan called Introducing the Instacorder, which we changed to InstaVideo, which was the first VCR. And the board bought the project. I headed the team that put the first prototype together and introduced the product in 1970 at the Americana Hotel in New York. It was an unbelievable experience for me. This was a product which was pretty obvious to anybody that looked at it. It was new, different, easy to understand. Everybody knew what the concept was all about. And in the process, the audience just went crazy. I knew, I was pretty young at the time, and I knew we had some kind of a hit. What I also knew was that Ampex was suffering terribly from financial problems, and whether or not the company itself had the ability to introduce the project, that is, to manufacture it, make it a commercialized success, was a big doubt in my mind. So as I say in my book, in an acknowledgement, it was one of these things where I thought we might have the most successful failure that the world had ever seen, and that's literally true. I mean, that's what I thought. So when we introduced the product, every newspaper, every television station, radio station, whatever, picked it up. It was a huge success. Bill Roberts came to me and said, we're going to manufacture this thing in Japan. I wanted to make a deal with Bob Galvin at Motorola. At that time, they had the Quasar television line, understood consumer electronics, and were right down the street. But the company that we wanted, that Roberts wanted to do a deal with, a company called Toshiba, which everybody knows today, was a company that we'd had prior relationships with, and he felt that it would be a great place to do business for several reasons. Number one, he felt, correctly so, that they'd put up whatever the money was, manufacturing expertise to make the product. And secondly, at that time, and Bill Roberts was not alone in this, Japan then was looked upon as a country that could do things by rote, was willing to manufacture with reasons of cheap labor or whatever else, products for the United States, such as video recorders, and that they would provide a service to us and not compete with us in the future in the end-use market. So I went to Japan, and the gentleman that headed up the negotiation for Toshiba was a gentleman by the name of Toshio Doko. Toshio Doko, it turns out, was not only chairman of Toshiba, which was a rather significant position, he also put a keiretsu together on the fly. I think it was maybe one of the only Japanese gentlemen that ever did that. That is, to put a conglomeration of countries and companies together. He was also chairman of Keidan Ren, which is the offset to MIDI, Ministry of International Trade, on the private sector side. So they strategically would periodically get together and determine where it was the right strategy for the country, for the companies involved, to take the nation, which at that time was trying to build itself from what had occurred after the Second World War. He was also chairman of the Expo 70, which was on the cover of Time magazine of that year, which was the World Exposition. So I knew I was negotiating with a very, very powerful man. We finished the negotiations. We got everything that we wanted. In theory, we should have been extremely happy. I had about 20 seconds of motivational, esprit, whatever. I felt like the world was mine. And then I took a look at what had just happened, and I turned to one of my associates at a little cocktail party we had for ourselves, and I said, I think we got what we wanted to get. I am almost certain they got what they wanted. And I think I was correct in that statement. We were looking for somebody who would manufacture our product. They were looking for a way of developing a series of technological steps toward the manufacturing of video recording, which they felt was scalable and could help build a nation. That's exactly what happened. The VCR became the largest single consumer electronic product the world had ever seen. It became the largest single user of semiconductor devices of any product in the world. At that time, there were no PCs. It became the largest user of displays, television sets, lenses, optics. It completely changed the robotics industry. What it wasn't was a device that was taking advantage of cheap labor. It was a device that was going to take advantage of unbelievable advancements in technology in all the various fields, including the semiconductor field. I watched that product grow and prosper in Japan. Ampex finally backed out because economically they couldn't afford to stay in the game. Nobody in the United States at that time wanted to be in consumer electronics. They thought it was a dog industry, a lot of competition, low margins, whatever else. So nobody really wanted to touch Ampex and video recording. The Japanese took it over between Sony, Toshiba, Matsushita, and whatever else. Everybody knows VHS and Beta, the Beta formats. When I introduced the product, it was 14,000 units total video recorders made in the world. By the end of the 80s, it was 50 million units. And today, as I will talk later on, if you give me a shot at it, I'll show you an iPhone, which is basically what the VCR was then. And now you're talking a billion plus units in the world. All of that technology effectively left the U.S. and went to Japan.
And that's the point of your book.
And that's the point of my book.
Well, let's turn to our guest host and see if he has a question for you. Mr. Kirkegaard?
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And I think it's very pertinent that once you describe, your own Apex experience of, coming out with a product that's easy to use and that everybody wants, and then this is 1970, because as you correctly point out, by the, middle of this decade, the similar product came out, which is, as you say, Apple's iPhone, which was a product that was, at least for cell phones, very easy to use. Everybody clearly wants it, and the new model they still want. And it's, and then you read on the back of it right here, designed by Apple in California and assembled in China. And, this seems very much like the mirror image of what you're just describing. Yet, there is a distinction between, 40 years have gone by, and it doesn't seem like, to me at least, that the United States has lost the technological edge. I mean, this was designed, by Apple. It wasn't designed by a Japanese company or anybody else. It was still, it seems to me that the high-end value-added stuff still remains in the United States.
It's interesting when people use the word design. It's hard to say, what does that really mean? I mean, that's a beautiful tie that you have. And the colors are perfect, and it fits your jacket and everything perfect, probably fits this room perfectly. But the fact of the matter is, the manufacture of that tie may have taken, and the development of the materials that went into it, or may take some amount of intellectual expertise beyond the design. In the case of the iPhone and cell phones generally, because this is a cell phone, my feeling is that what Apple brings to this, and by the way, I don't underestimate this at all. I think Apple is one of the great companies of the United States. Steve Jobs has to be one of the more brilliant managers to walk the face. And it's because of their experience with the Mac and all of the products, the interrelationship with iTunes and the software it can bring to bear, that you have an overall product that is truly unique at this point in time. But my experience with the VCR says that in the long term, and the long term can take a while, it could take 10 years, 20 years, could take 5 minutes. In the long term, if somebody else develops the software that gives you the operational characteristics and ties that to a platform with some kind of a special edge that you might not be able to get your hands on initially, it's possible then that Apple will be competing with a company and potentially a country that doesn't necessarily want to provide right off the bat the proprietary technology behind the platform when they put their own software on it, and the next thing you know, you got a bit of a problem. The other thing to recognize is this. The particular chip that's in this phone that really made everything possible is something called NAND flash. It's a memory device. In 1988, I made a talk, and in that talk I said, you know, we got to be careful what we think about VCRs and all this stuff, the fact that we're not in it, because somebody's going to make a component one of these days that's going to do everything on that component that this big recorder and camera and a television set does all in one, okay? If that ever happens, it's going to change the face of computing and every other device that you could plug this component into. The very next year, Toshiba announced NAND flash. Okay, designed in Japan. NAND flash is what gives this the power, obviously the computing power, processing power as well. But that memory device has a huge part to play in the fact that you can record and play back video, audio, and then utilize that information whatever you want, including broadcasting it wirelessly to whatever other platform you want anywhere in the world. That NAND flash was not developed here. It was developed in Japan. Today, the NAND flash is being provided to us by the Asians. It's also manufactured, fortunately, by a company called Micron and Int'l in a company called IM Flash. If it were not, and I'm going to give you an example in a second of something like that, if it were not, and they chose not to give it to us until a little bit later, we might have more of a difficult time trying to have this product called ours. But notice one other thing with Apple. That iPhone came out, and right behind it came LG Electronics with their product that looks very much like this, and another one called from HTC. I think it's High Computing Technology.
People aren't queuing up for that.
Right, that's true, and thank goodness, right, for the United States and for Apple. But way back in the olden days, as my children might say, in the olden days, when we came up with a VCR, and then before that audio recording, first the decks were put into our devices and we provided what we called the front end and the so-called glamour and look and feel that you see in an iPhone. The next thing you know, the Japanese and then the rest of Asia began to provide that, and all of a sudden the decks became more expensive, difficult to get, and the next thing you know, we were out of the business. We have all kinds of companies like Apple that can give us an edge back into the business. But if we lose the manufacturing expertise, if we lose the componentry that in fact are the guts of this product, at some point in time we'll lose the top end as well.
So, Mr. Elkus, you're saying that the manufacture of a product such as the Apple iPhone should be in the U.S.?
The answer is yes, absolutely. What I'm not saying is that all manufacturing has to be in the U.S. Obviously that doesn't work. I mean, and there's another reason for that than just that we shouldn't have it all. But manufacturing and engineering go hand in hand in understanding what you can do, what you can innovate with, how many different kinds of approaches you can take to a problem, what is possible. If you lose your manufacturing, if all you have is the top-end engineering, and somehow you don't have an absolutely integral relationship with the person that's manufacturing your product, you lose your ability to create, you lose your ability to innovate. Nothing comes out of the ether. So, for example, if you assume that the person that's manufacturing your product, which finally can turn out to be more difficult than the design of the product in the first place, is always going to be there to provide you with what you want and never come up with a product to compete with you, that's usually a mistake. If they finally come up with a product to compete with you and you assume that you're going to be able to get access to the best they have to offer, that's probably a mistake too.
And that's one of the policies that Mr. Elkus calls for in his new book, Winner Take All. Mr. Kirkegaard, next question.
I think that's one of the things that I was struck by when I read your book over the weekend was this very elaborate description of, you know, Moore's two laws, as I guess I will call them. One of them is the one we all know about, which is, you know, that computers tend to get faster and, you know, double in capacity every 18 months. But the other one, which I think subtly links to what you just said, which is that, you know, actually the cost of producing this new generation of chips also grows exponentially. And in order to stay in the game, as you just put it, of advanced you know, chip manufacturing, you know, you really have to put up, you know, literally billions of dollars every time you have a new generation. So couldn't you, I mean, I guess my broader point is, isn't it actually smart from a company like Apple to say, well, okay, you know, I'm not going to put in, you know, $5 or $10 billion to produce the manufacturing facilities for this next chip. I'm just going to produce the product that everybody likes using that technology. Or if you're like an IBM, for instance, essentially sell your hardware business to a Chinese company and then just concentrate on services. Because services, unlike, you know, chips and computers in general, they don't decline in price at the same rate.
First of all, let me give you an idea of the impact of Moore's Law. Moore's Law basically says that you can double the number of transistors, little electronic devices that help you compute, in a given area of silicon every couple of years. If you took a penny and you doubled it every single day for 31 days, a month, okay, at the end of 31 days, you'd have $21+ million. That's one penny, okay, doubles, 1, 2, 4, 8. You'd have $21+ million. At the end of another week, you'd have close to $3 billion. That's a lot of pennies. People have no idea the implications of exponential increases in anything. Because of that law, one would say, what are you going to do with all these transistors? I mean, at some point, you can't fill the room with transistors, you know, except that the amount of computing power, as the cost per unit goes down, okay, highly scalable. You can make the right kind of machinery, you can produce lots and lots. It turns out that all the products and markets track Moore's Law, that come from it, tracks Moore's Law. So you get this exponential increase in products, markets, all the things we like that give us the standard of living that we're used to and enjoy, okay? If you get off that train, if you find out that you no longer want to put up that kind of money, so for example, in 1983, to build a fabrication facility to make semiconductors cost you $50 million, that same fabrication facility today might cost you $6+ billion, okay? If you get off that train, which is easy to get off because the risk gets higher and higher, it's very, very difficult to ever get back on again because everybody around you is advancing exponentially. But the fact of the matter is, if you stay on the train, if you understand the game you're in and you're good at it, that is, you design the right kind of products that ultimately succeed, you find that the markets that you have grow to the point where nations are built, not just companies are built. This is why it was so important for Japan. So to answer your particular question, I think that services, first of all, they're easy to outsource. In truth, you can truly take advantage of so-called low-cost labor with services. Morgan Stanley has a whole research group set up in India. I think it's in Bangalore. to do some of the research. I mean, there's all kinds of things. If you go to the back end of your accounting firm, you'll find that much of the services they have are outsourced. There are many things that you can outsource in services. You can outsource most anything, but the fact of the matter is that the proprietary value added is where margin comes from. It's where the amount of economic wherewithal to advance the state of the nation comes from. You lose that, my feeling is you lose the country.
This is Communicators, and our guest is Richard Elkus, high-tech entrepreneur and businessman, winner take all, how competitiveness shapes the fate of nations. You call for an industrial policy. And Mr. Elkus, you use HDTV as an example of where the U.S. has gone wrong. And this is a good time to briefly touch on that from your book while we're in this transition.
Okay. One quick comment. When you say industrial policy, what I really say is we need a strategy. The country needs a strategy. Strategies are built by, you know, policies that kind of fit within the strategy, but what I'm looking for is a strategy. Okay? HDTV. Initially, I think it was 1985, I talked about high-definition television. I'd seen the first example of that in Japan in 1970. I came back and I said to my associates and then later on to other people in other industries and whatever, that if we didn't take a look at HDTV and understand the implications of it, and at that time I felt we were losing the display industry.
In fact, is it fair to say that you considered HDTV a national security issue, almost?
Well, it wasn't just me. I mean, the government wrote several reports indicating that this could be a national security situation, because high-definition television isn't really television per se. It's the ability to process lots and lots of information. I mean, we all take it for granted now. We're about to go 3G, and all of a sudden you can get everything you want instantaneously on your iPhone or whatever phone that you're using. High-definition television is the ability to process lots of information, handle it very quickly in different ways, which offers you the ability to do any number of different things. It really infuses every product and market that I can think of. What I was concerned about was that to the extent that we have to be dependent upon other countries to get processes that allow us to process that much information and don't have it indigenous to the United States of America, not only does it affect the television industry, the electronics industry, it starts to affect the automobile industry, the aircraft industry, the nuclear industry, every other industry. And my concern was we were about to lose something that not only was going to be a huge economic boon to somebody, but it was potentially going to be absolutely essential to every other product and market on this earth. And to be very honest with you, at the time that I was talking, we still made television sets. And the company that was helping foster what turned out to be our high-definition television standard for the United States of America was a company called Zenith. It turned out that Zenith was the last television company in the United States of America. It was bought for $360 million in 1996. That's 12 years ago. There are no more television sets that I know of any consequence, or displays for that matter, displays being anything that shows a picture, made in the United States. Today, a single fabrication facility to manufacture a flat screen display, which are going to be used to view this program, costs about $3.5 billion, just one display. If somebody says to the United States, we have to be back in this business, which is the basis for high-definition television and the processing of all the information I've talked about, we're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars. So to get back in is really, really tough. We have an interesting situation that's occurring because of this. In I think, February of 2009, there is an industrial policy that was passed by President Bush for the United States to go digital. That is, from that point on, you're not going to be able to see analog television on your set. Everybody has to go digital. There are no digital television sets manufactured in the United States. So either you buy a special analog to digital converter, which I think people will find to be somewhat less than satisfactory, or you convert to a digital television set. There are 85 million, I think, analog sets still available in the country. If you do any of those things, you're going to Asia to get the product. If for whatever reason, obviously this would not happen, but if for any reason they decide they didn't want to supply those products, or the price went up, or whatever else, we would have a really tough time implementing that policy. Supposing it was a defense item, I mean, I can't imagine that we would take it lightly. And if you're talking about a balance of trade problem, this is not the world's biggest, but it isn't going to help our balance of trade any. So that was the reason why I was talking about high definition.
Mr. Kirkegaard.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the issue of industrial standards, and as you could call it, proactive or strategic government regulation is a very interesting point, and another one of those which I was really struck by when I read your book, because in terms of government regulation, you know, the approach in the United States tends to be, you know, the less the better, and you know, it's really sort of the Ayn Rand approach to regulating. But you also in the book mention the issue of the GSM standard, which was basically put together by the Europeans for mobile telephony, which was clearly a case of industrial policy, if you like, through the use of industrial standards. And so you think, I mean, as part of this strategy, you call it, for competitiveness, does the U.S. need to rethink the way it regulates industries in many ways?
I guess the answer is yes, but my feeling is that the kinds of problems I'm really trying to address are not going to ultimately be solved by regulation. The United States, at the end of World War II, dominated every product market on this earth, 2/3 of the GDP of the world. The rest was divided up not only amongst many, many nations, so nobody really had much, but most of them were very, very badly beaten down by the Second World War. So we could do anything, and it didn't make much difference. If we made a mistake, we could always recoup. That isn't the case anymore. Nope. We became highly opportunistic after that because we could. And so, and again, I'm speaking for myself, and I'm also not trying to suggest something that's moral, that is right or wrong. It's just whatever you want, you may get it, okay? So there was a gentleman by the name of Bruce Henderson for the Boston Consulting Group that came up with a concept called stars, cash cows, and dogs. He did this in 1965, the same year that Moore came up with Moore's Law. That's amazing, both out of the semiconductor industry. And stars, cash cows, and dogs was a relatively simplistic approach that said you put your money in the stars, you milk the cash cows, that is something where there's not a lot of R&D, you're not going to go much, generates a lot of cash, you put that money in the stars. You take, stars would be like Google is today, and you take dogs, that is industries where there's lots of competition, low margins, you can't really make a lot of money, you sell those off and you put your money in the stars, okay? Every single business school in the country adopted it, and a heck of a lot of the corporations. I was a part of selling a company to a company in Boston, a major company on the New York Exchange, and the first meeting I had at board level there was using stars, cash cows, and dogs to analyze our business and other businesses that they were buying or selling. Stars, cash cows, and dogs for us, when we owned everything, was very, very helpful in making a decision. But if you think about it, not in terms of Moore's Law, but in terms of how you make a decision like that, it's very, very short term. It really is taking an arbitrage on a discontinuity between something that happened yesterday and what you think might happen tomorrow. Moore's Law, if you talk about, you know, exponential increase, Moore's Law suggests that the world is going to change beyond anything you can possibly imagine over a period of relatively few years, but year upon year upon year. The United States adopted stars, cash cows, and dogs. Asia adopted Moore's Law. In stars, cash cows, and dogs, the way you take an opportunity and make it very profitable and require very little cash is you take somebody that's worrying about Moore's Law and say, why don't you do it for me? So in the case of a display manufacturing operation, in the case of a semiconductor operation, or for that matter, even the production of consumer electronics, somebody says, look, I'll build the factory for you. You don't have to put up any of that cash. I'll provide you with the inventory when you need it, how you need it, in whatever form you want it. I'll take the quality control. You just take care of the marketing and the overall design. And for a while, that really works, and you make a lot of money. And by the way, if you're making a lot of money and your competitor down the street is not, your investors go to him and say, either you change, we throw you out, buy your company, or whatever else, but we know how to make your company make much more than it's making now, which may be great for the stockholders as of the moment, may be lousy for the United States of America. Now, this all comes to pass when your competitors are using Moore's Law and you're using stars, cash cows, and dogs. If it's everybody operating on the same basis, then it's just my wits against your wits. But I don't think that's what's happening. So I had a fascinating experience. I bumped into Aki Morita, who I knew pretty well, in Hawaii in the early 90s. And he asked me over to his apartment at the Hyatt on the island of Kauai, and we talked about high-definition television and a standard. And he said, I'd like you to do me a favor. I'd like you to come to the United States and call the Secretary of Commerce, who I knew a little bit, and tell him that Sony would be willing to finance the technology, provide technological expertise, anything that the United States wanted in order to establish a U.S. standard, not a Japanese standard, a U.S. standard for high-definition television. Okay? So I came back, I called the Secretary of Commerce, and I presented the offer, which was absolutely genuine. Okay? And I said, but remember one thing, that Sony and the rest of Japan doesn't care who builds or who decides what the dimensions of the highway will be. They want to build the cars. If we don't get into this industry, if we don't become viable, we're going to set up the highway for our consumers to buy their cars.
And we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time, Mr. Elkus. Richard Elkus is the author of Winner Take All. We didn't get into the book as much as we wanted to, but if those of you who are interested in the history of the high-tech world and today's high-tech world and some of the public policy issues surrounding it, Winner Take All is the name of the book. Richard Elkus is the author. Jacob Kirkegaard, originally from Denmark, has been our co-host. He is a research associate at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.